Okay, so we're going to dive into a story that's over 100 years old, but you're about to see how scarily relevant it feels right now. It's a story all about immigration, about fear, and really a full-blown cultural panic aimed at a tiny group of people coming to America from India. We're going to look at the deep, deep roots of anti-Hindu sentiment right here in the United States.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll see what happened when the first Indian immigrants arrived and the immediate backlash they faced. Then, we'll watch as that hostility zeroes in on a new target, Hindu spiritual leaders. Next, we'll get into how one single book basically lit a firestorm across the whole country. And finally, we're going to hear from the powerful voices that decided to fight back.
You know, for the longest time, Hinduism was this kind of abstract idea for most Americans. It was something you'd only read about in books. But then, in the early 1900s, that all changed. Actual Indian immigrants began arriving on American shores, and suddenly, this far-off concept was a domestic issue. And the newspapers, they started screaming about a so-called Hindu invasion.
And what's really wild is just how fast this all happened. I mean, the hostility went from the streets to the law books in a flash. It kicks off with mob violence, right? Like the Bellingham riot in 1907. But just 10 years later, the government makes it official with something called the Barred Zone Act. And then, get this, the Supreme Court itself drops the hammer, ruling that Indians weren't white persons, and boom, they couldn't become citizens. Just like that.
So with all this panic, all these new laws, you're probably thinking it must have been for a huge wave of people, right? Well, here's the real kicker. The grand total of Indian immigrants in the entire U.S. by 1920 was about 6,400. That's it. And believe it or not, most of them weren't even Hindu. They were largely Sikhs and Muslims. But it didn't matter. They all got slapped with the same label, Hindus. The reaction was just completely disconnected from reality.
So where did these negative ideas even come from? Well, they didn't just pop up out of thin air. They'd actually been floating around for years, pushed by some of America's most famous writers. I mean, just listen to this quote from Mark Twain. He's talking about a wild mob of nightmares. That image of Hinduism as something bizarre and frightening was already baked into the American psyche way before the first immigrants ever showed up.
Okay, so the fear started with the immigrants themselves, but it quickly morphed into something else, a full-blown religious panic. And the new bullseye was on Hindu spiritual teachers, or swamis. They were opening centers here in the States and, well, they were attracting American followers, especially American women.
So you had critics like this woman, Elizabeth Reed, who were painting this really sinister picture of what a guru was. In her telling, these weren't spiritual guides. Nope, they were money-making inventions, basically predators. She claimed they demanded total, absolute ownership of their followers, a relationship she literally described as abject slavery.
I mean, listen to this. This is the kind of stuff they were passing around. This supposed vow from a disciple was meant to be the smoking gun. The proof of this hypnotic control the swamis had. It's so over the top, right? It was designed to shock people, to make them picture these followers as just helpless, brainwashed victims. But here's where you see the massive gap between the scary stories and what was actually happening. While all these critics were screaming about a heathen invasion, the biggest Hindu group at the time, the Vedanta Society, was on the record as being non-proselytizing. They weren't trying to convert anybody. Their whole point was to have intellectual discussions with people who were interested.
So when you boil it all down, the panic really came from just a few core fears. It was this perfect storm of a narrative. You have these mysterious men from a foreign land, right? And they're using strange powers to steal American women, scramble their brains, and this is the big one, take all their money. It was all about protecting white womanhood and, of course, their family fortunes. That was the theme, over and over and over again. So you've got this panic just simmering under the surface for years. And then, in 1927, it just explodes into the mainstream. And the spark that lit the fuse? It was one single book, Mother India, by an American writer named Catherine Mayo. This book took every one of those fears, every stereotype we've been talking about, and just supercharged them into a national obsession.
Mayo's central argument was, well, it was breathtakingly simple and absolutely shocking. She basically claimed that every single one of India's problems, we're talking poverty, disease, political weakness, all of it, could be traced back to just one thing, a national obsession with sex. And, she claimed, this obsession was being actively encouraged by the Hindu religion itself.
And she did not hold back. She made these incredibly inflammatory claims, directly linking the worship of Hindu deities like Shiva to the corruption of children. She was literally arguing that their own religion was teaching little kids to be obsessed with sex right from the cradle. It's pretty extreme stuff.
And boy, did this book land with a bang. It was a massive hit, a top 10 bestseller for 2 years straight. But the pushback was just as intense and immediate. Its most famous critic, of course, was Mohandas Gandhi. He famously called it a drain inspector's report, a brilliant way of saying it was a book that intentionally looked only for the muck while ignoring everything of value.
But here's the thing. Gandhi was not alone. Not by a long shot. A really diverse group of people pushed back hard against this tidal wave of stereotypes. You had Indian intellectuals, you had Americans who had converted to Hinduism, and you even had some Christian missionaries joining the chorus.
So the question is, how do you even begin to fight back against a narrative that's so juicy, so sensational, and so incredibly popular? Well, they fought back with logic, with personal testimony, and with some seriously clever and biting satire.
One of the smartest takedowns came from a writer named Dehan Gopal Mukherjee. He just brilliantly exposed what he called Mayo's racial myopia by flipping the script. He basically said, okay, what if I wrote a book about America, but I only included chapters on lynchings, marital scandals, and child labor? It was such a sharp, perfect way to show just how hypocritical and biased her whole project was.
Then you have this really powerful voice from an American woman, Sister Devamata, who had actually converted to Hinduism. So Mayo's book paints Indian women as these powerless, mindless slaves, right? Well, Devamata, writing from her own lived experience, says, no. She describes the mother as the ruling spirit of the house, the one holding the purse strings, directing the whole household. The difference between those two pictures is just night and day.
And maybe the most surprising critics of all? American Christian missionaries. These are people who had actually spent years living and working in India. Take this one guy, Alden Clark. He called the book a blow against truth. He argued it was just plain harmful, that it was actively training people, both in America and India, to see only the most indecent and beastly things in each other.
And just to really drive the point home, to fight back against this image of a totally chaotic, sex-obsessed society, Sister Devamata laid out what a typical day was like in a South Indian home. And it's just this picture of order, discipline, worship, and spiritual life. It is the absolute polar opposite of the lurid fantasy that Catherine Mayo is selling to millions of Americans.
So, yeah, this all happened 100 years ago, a whole century. But just think about the fears that were driving all of this. Fear of immigrants, the other, panic about a foreign religion, using women's bodies and sexuality as battlegrounds in a culture war. Does any of that sound familiar? It really makes you stop and ask, what echoes of this exact same story are we still hearing in the arguments we have today?